Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second in our true crime series. Today, we'll be doing lab science CSI versus IRL. So just a couple things before we get started. First, I want to remind you that you have the chat. So if you have any questions for our presenter, please feel free to put them in the chat as we go. And Professor Cox is here, so she's going to help us monitor the chat. Also, we will be giving credit for this at the end. So stick around to the very end and then make sure you get the link, click on that, fill out the form, and that's how you get credit for attending. Every professor does have a different policy on how you get the credit. So just make sure that you are reading those policies from your instructor and then reach out and ask if you have questions. One more thing before we get started, because we are going to be talking about lab science, there is some detail here that might get a little triggering for some people, especially in the case of sexual assault. So I just want everyone to be aware that we're going to be talking about that, not graphically, but if that's something that is traumatic or problematic for you, please take care of yourself first and just know that going into this conversation. All right, so I would like to welcome Ms. Natalie Russell to our webinar today.
All right, thank you, Misty. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here this morning. And I'm super excited to see several of my students that I have in class that are here and some other names that I don't recognize. So glad to be here.
Natalie, right now you are currently one of our biology professors at the Connect campus.
Yes, I am.
What did you do in your previous life?
So many moons ago, out of graduate school, I actually worked at it's called the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences. That's the official name. It's the Dallas County Crime Lab, and I worked in the physical science lab or the physical evidence lab, and specifically I worked in the biology lab. So we dealt with body fluids and DNA testing, and as part of that, and I'll talk about this a little later, but many forensic biologists are specialized, and so I completed a training through the FBI to be able to do mitochondrial DNA analysis.
So you were real life CSI.
So technically not CSI, but a forensic biologist, yes.
So in that show CSI, I've watched it a couple of times.
Yes.
There is this main detective, and he goes and he investigates the case and he interviews people, and he also runs all of the science. How real is that?
So that's absolutely not the way things work in the real world. So yes, you see him with a gun, you see him at the crime scene collecting evidence, he does hair, he does DNA, all kinds of blood spatter. In the real world, there would be multiple individuals that would be carrying this out. So I was never given a gun or a badge or a Hummer or anything like that. I never left the lab other than to go testify. And we'll talk a little bit about the testimony later, but the forensic analysts are always going to be specialized in what they do. So if you're someone who does DNA, you're probably not doing, firearms examination. You're not doing gunshot residue, right? There's a different expert that's working on that part of the case. So yes, that's not realistic. And there wouldn't be enough time, right? It takes a long time anyway. There wouldn't be enough time for one person to do all of that stuff. So I just wanted to kind of give the students an idea. So CSI obviously stands for Crime Scene Investigator, and those are the people that are actually physically going out to wherever the crime happened. And their job is just to make sure any evidence is collected in a way that is safe for everybody and that retains anything that can be tested. So they are trained in how you handle the evidence, how you store it. If things are wet, obviously you don't want to store them where they're going to mold, and that's going to cause problems with us being able to find, a good DNA sample. The other important thing for everybody, from the crime scene investigator all the way through to the end, is a chain of custody, because we want to know, right, that who has had access to that item, what they did to that item, what they took from that item. And so by the time the case gets to trial, That's an important thing to be able to show, that at no point was this item outside of someone's, protection, or anyone had access to it that could have done something to that item of evidence. Then, of course, the crime scene investigators typically have a law enforcement or a legal background. They understand, about what they can have access to and how they can treat different scenes. I don't have any of that kind of training. So I could help them, and occasionally we did have trainings to explain how best can you preserve, biological samples or DNA. What's the best way to collect those from a crime scene? But the legal and law enforcement background is not something that I have. Now, on the flip side, so a completely different set of individuals would be the forensic scientists, and we're the ones that are stuck in the laboratory wearing the lab coats, right? They don't let us out much. And as I mentioned, there's different specialties. So one person is not doing all of those things. There are different labs. So just like, let's say for an example, if a casing, right, a bullet casing was found at a crime scene and it was submitted as evidence. So that particular bullet casing might go, first it would probably go to fingerprinting, right? Because those are maybe the things that would get disturbed by the other labs. And the fingerprint expert's going to try to get fingerprints. Then it might go to our lab, to our biology lab. So we're looking for blood, any kind, and in fact, you can now, even if there's not blood, on many items, you can get DNA based on skin cells left behind from someone handling that. So we might swab it for that. And then it might go on down to the firearms, right, where they examine it to determine like what kind of bullet, was in this, what kind of gun fired it. Are there any markings on it that indicate something about the kind of gun that was used? And every single analyst or forensic scientist that handle that evidence is going to write a separate report to say, here's what I found, here's what I didn't find, whatever is pertinent to that piece of evidence. And then the forensic scientist will provide, typically, at least have the potential to provide expert witness if that case actually does go to trial. So each individual person, right, could be called to testify on what they examined, what they found. So it's not surprising that most people who work in the forensic sciences areas come from some kind of science background. So chemistry, biology, biochemistry, some kind of background like that.
Thanks. Okay, so I just want to let everybody know that Professor Allegra Davis-Hanna also showed up.
Yeah.
So she's here in the room with me as well.
Welcome.
So Natalie, what is the time frame for solving a case? Because on CSI, they solve everything in 45 minutes or less.
I know, they're much better than we were. So certainly, it's not a 24-hour situation. The thing that's interesting about the crime shows is that there's always like this one or two pieces of evidence that are obviously from the very beginning key, right? And that's all that they're working on. But in reality, when evidence comes in from a case, right, those crime scene investigators, once they leave that scene, that's it, right? So they have to collect everything that might possibly be pertinent, and you don't know at the time. So, I mean, there could be, sometimes 100 items that are collected from a crime scene for each case. So when you think about it, so if I get assigned a case and I go down to the evidence room and say, I would like evidence for this case number, I mean, they might give me 100 items that I have to analyze for that case. And of course, unfortunately, right, there's not just one case, one crime that happens every day, right? There's multiple crimes. So there are so many items of evidence to be analyzed that it's just, the workload is very large. In addition, as I mentioned, with those hundreds of pieces of evidence, those each need to be analyzed typically by more than one person or more than one lab. So it is very, very time intensive. And, as scientists, obviously, we're reading what happened in the case, looking at what evidence is submitted, and we're starting with those that seem to be the most probative, but you don't know how many things you'll have to analyze before you actually find some kind of, so in my case, biological fluid or DNA on the items. So yes, it's certainly more time intensive. And we'll talk, maybe later about expectations, but I do think that that sets a really bad expectation for detectives and attorneys to expect that if they turn in a piece of evidence, we're going to have a DNA profile in an hour. There's no way.
Typically, how long would you work one case?
So they all vary, right? The ones that have just like 10 pieces of evidence or less, so step one would be what we would call the serology. And that just means you're literally looking at that item. Is there blood? Depending on the type of case, is there blood? Is there sweat? Can you get skin cells from someone who's worn it? Is there semen, or sperm? So the serology for a simple case, you could do in a day, right? But then those samples are collected, and then typically it might be the same person doing the DNA on those items, but it might be somebody else. And so then that would be sent to DNA, and there's always a backlog of cases waiting for DNA because you have less people that are qualified to do the DNA versus the serology. And there's less equipment. It takes very expensive equipment to do that. So there's only so many of those. So I would say in what we would consider a rush case, and there definitely, right, were times when some cases were pushed to the front. If there was a violent sexual assault, with the potential that person is still out, that would be moved to the front of the line, right? If we could possibly prevent another crime from happening versus if it was maybe, a murder with someone that they knew and there was a potential for this to be a danger to, the greater Dallas area. So I forgot your original question, but on a rush case, probably 2 weeks, right, before you actually have a DNA, maybe a week on a DNA profile.
So those shows make it seem like it's very exciting to work in a crime lab. Was that your experience? Did you go in every day and just like solve crimes left and right?
So, so it is much more boring, right? First of all, nobody wears designer clothes, or at least not that I worked with. So we look more like this than, in high heels and with our hair freshly done. And the truth is, anytime you're working in a lab, there are just mundane tasks that you have to do, but those are so important because, for example, when you're looking for an item of clothing and you're looking for a body fluid, there are different chemical tests that we would do. So let's say that I get this jacket in, right? And it's a suspect's jacket, and they say, we think this has the victim's blood on it. Maybe it was like a aggravated assault or something. We think this has the victim's blood on it. So obviously the first thing you're doing, because blood is red, you're looking to see if you can see any blood on the jacket. And if you do, you swab a little bit of that with a sterile Q-tip, and then we have we call them presumptive tests. So we have a reagent that we drop on that swab, and we're looking for a color change. So if you've watched CSI and you've seen how they go in a room and they spray luminol around the room and they turn all the lights off and then it glows really brightly and they say, oh, that's where the blood was. That would be what you would call a presumptive test. Because that doesn't mean it was blood. It means there's a chemical there that reacted with that luminol. Blood does it, bleach does it, lots of things do it. But it is one way, right? You start to narrow down, how do I collect samples off of this? So the point is, those reagents that you're using to find out, is this blood or is this paint or is this, something else? You have to make sure that you're checking those each day, do a quality control test, because you need your reagents. You need to be able to say, yes, I know this reagent was valid when I used it, right? That's important to do good science. And as I mentioned, documenting the evidence, documenting the chain of custody is critical. If you do everything else well and you don't do those things, that case will never hold up. So the first thing, there's a lot of taking pictures and drawing items, because so let's say I worked a case this month. Chances are I won't get called to testify about that until maybe, 10 months or a year later. Well, I've worked hundreds of items right since then. I can't rely on my memory to, when they come up to me and say, is this the jacket you examined? So I have to make really good notes. Draw the jacket. Are there any markings on the jacket? Where were the spots I took? How many spots did I take? Number them. All of those things are very time consuming, but they're important so that you have, you're doing good science and you're making sure you're representing what you did well. Okay, another thing. So these presumptive tests, they are one way to begin to narrow down what you're doing. But then you need to confirm. So with blood, if I find a sample and say, yes, it was positive with my little presumptive test that I'm using, I need to go further. I need to say, well, is it dog blood, right? I mean, I don't have to say it's dog blood, but it could be, right? It could be from a dog. It could be from something else. So I need to confirm it's human blood, right? So I'll do a species test on that. Then at that point, once we've confirmed, yes, it's blood, yes, it's human, then when we take it to get a DNA profile, there's no question, right? That all the steps were done. I've documented everything. With a sexual assault case and you're looking for semen, first of all, it's harder to find because it's not red, right? Like blood, it doesn't visually show up. So you've probably also seen them use a black light in the CSI shows. And that's a good way to identify body fluids, but it's going to identify sweat, saliva, semen, any kind of body fluid. So we have another presumptive test that we do on the spot that we think could possibly be from semen. And it's also a color change. But again, that's just a presumptive test. It says it could be, right? It's likely that it's semen, but we have to go further. And the way we do that is you actually have to make a little sample on a slide from wherever you got that, sheet or clothing, and you have to examine it under the microscope and verify, did you see sperm or not in that sample? So that's what you see on this image. These are about 3 different sperm that you see on that slide. And the reason I showed you that is there you spend a pretty good amount of time sitting in front of a microscope looking around on this slide to see, can I confirm in fact that there are sperm there? So there's a lot of routine type work that you do. It's also, I mentioned to Misty, it's also very depressing work because you see the worst in people and the worst in society every single day. Before I went to work for the crime lab, I was a huge reader of like Patricia Cromwell and those kinds of books. I love that kind of thriller stuff. Once I started that job, I'm done. I don't watch CSI. I don't read those books. And I think it's probably because it became very real to me, real people, the reality of it. So you kind of have to detach yourself from that when you leave every day because you do see the worst of people. And the other thing that takes a lot of time, as I mentioned, there's a lot of report writing because the whole point of your analysis is to provide information for the detectives that are trying to solve the case, right? Both the defense and the prosecutor who are trying to either convict or defend their client. So you do a lot of preparing reports, and in an effort to make sure that what we're putting out as a lab is correct and accurate and have quality control, you also are reviewing a lot of reports from your colleagues, right, to make sure that there's no errors or to catch any errors before that they go out. Now, in my time, I was there almost 3 years. I don't know, but obviously I worked hundreds of cases. I testified less than 10 times. And that's because many, many times, especially in the DNA side of things, the way it would work is, let's say there's a sexual assault case that comes in, there's a someone who's arrested and they say, I don't know this person, I've never seen this person. We get a sample, we make a match, it's a DNA match, and then they end up reaching a plea agreement. So many, many times you don't actually go to trial because they reach a plea, but the evidence was part of the reason that happened, right? So it doesn't make it less important. It just means that expert witness testimony was sort of a minor piece of what we did. So I've rambled on a long time.
So I think, if I was watching a show and it was just people in a lab looking at a slide for 30 minutes, that would be very boring to me.
And that would be very common.
So yeah, it's not portraying real life because real life is boring.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is.
So that CSI effect, I think we all think of like all the different things you could test, but what items do you really test in a lab?
Okay, so here's the thing, and I am a self-proclaimed germaphobe anyway, but like the first thing that I would do when I got home every day was put those clothes in the dirty clothes and take a shower, because the things that you're dealing with are gross. That's the reality of it. It's not glamorous in any way. So when you go to get evidence, right, to work it, these are, soiled sheets are probably one of the most common, and that's from people's homes. That's from hotels. I do not stay in a hotel today that all the bedding is not washed, because I can tell you from seeing lots of bedspreads that there's way more samples of biological human things on there than could happen from one stay. So that just tells me they're not always laundered really well. So anyway, lots of hotel bedding, soiled sheets, used condoms, other things that I don't want to even mention to you, dirty undergarments, bloody clothes, obviously, weapons like a knife, things like that that would have blood or something on them. And the other thing that you got to think about is, in Texas or places where it gets really hot in the summer, it doesn't take very long for a body to be outside in the Texas weather before decomposition sets in. And, you're getting those clothes, right, off that body. So, yeah, it doesn't smell real great. So that's the reality of what you're working with every day. Not glamorous.
I don't even know what to say to that last one, Natalie. So I think CSI has changed a lot of our expectations and maybe perceptions. But could you speak to that a little more directly?
Sure. So my time in the lab was I think like 99 or 2000s when I started, and I left in 2003. And so that was, almost 20 years ago. And at that time, DNA testing was still, as far as a regular use, it was in regular use, but it was still new. And the detectives and the attorneys, really were learning about it sort of on the fly, like they were learning as we were doing it. But obviously they were influenced by these shows. And so I think the time was one of the huge things, that their expectation for the time. Same thing with the jury, right? When people serve on a jury, they come to the jury with whatever kind of information and background that they've been exposed to, and what they've seen on TV is one of those things. One of the things that everybody has probably seen, whether you even watch CSI or not, it may be on the news or something, you've all seen this idea of luminol testing. And because, it's really visually appealing. That's a cool thing to put on TV. You go in a room and turn off the lights and it glows all around. And I think that influences people, that it makes it seem like it's super easy. It doesn't really matter. You just have these awesome ways that you can find anything, no matter what, right? And obviously, if we did that to a room that had been cleaned with bleach, we would see all these stains. That doesn't mean that that's blood. It also doesn't mean that it's even important to the case. So we had a case one time that it was a woman was killed in her home, and the suspect was her husband. But he had admitted, right, that he had said he had found her there, and he had tried to, give her aid and all that. So, according to his own testimony, he had touched her and he had tried to revive her and all these things, and that was the house he lived in. But the detectives wanted DNA done on all kinds of things from their home. Well, that doesn't mean anything, right? Yeah, okay. There's blood on the carpet that's hers and his. Yep, they live there. There's blood on, I don't know, his shirt. Yep, he was there offering her aid. DNA is not the be all end all. Sometimes it's not meaningful at all to the case. So if you've been watching CSI for a long time, there was one really interesting case called Bloodlines. And it was about a suspect who was what's called a chimera. Now, chimeras, so what you see on the right, the reason I'm showing you this flower is that that is an example of a chimera. So that flower actually was 2 baby plants or 2 embryos that early in development fused together. So there's one organism, but 2 sets of DNA or 2 sets of genetic material. And that's why you can see it there, because it was 2 different colors. So this suspect, so it's very, very, very rare for humans, but it is not, there's been about 200 documented cases. I'm sure there's more, but it's extremely rare. It's the same thing. In utero, there are 2 embryos, but very early on, they fuse into one organism, and therefore there's 2 sets of DNA. So it can be that the DNA that's in the blood cells, right, the DNA there is different than the DNA in the semen. And that was the case for this particular individual. So he was arrested or suspected of raping an individual, and the semen from the rape kit didn't match his blood sample. And that's because he was a chimera. So those are extremely rare, but those kinds of really strange cases can put doubt in people's minds about the validity of DNA testing, right? Where that doesn't ever mean that if you get a match, it's not valid. It just starts to make people question, what do we really know about this DNA testing, right? The other thing I want to say is, one time in trial, a friend of mine, so I had done the serology piece of a case. So I had already testified to what I found and what I did with it and blah, blah, blah. And then I sat down and my colleague went up to testify because he had done the DNA. And while he was on the stand, you have to think, if you're a defense attorney and that person is on the stand, is the person you're defending, there's a match that says nobody else with this DNA profile would be expected, to have this profile, unless it was, 1 in, I don't know what it was, let's say 100 billion people. Well, there's only about 6 or 7 billion people on the earth. So, I mean, that's really, really bad for your client, right? So what do you do with that information? But this defense attorney, I thought, was really, really smart. So after my friend did his testimony, and, it was very damning testimony, it looked really bad for the defendant, he said, okay, so, what were the odds of winning the lottery, the Texas lottery last night? And my friend was like, I don't know. So he said, well, would you be surprised if it was 1 in whatever it was? Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, but the population of Texas is less than that. Okay, yeah, but somebody won. And I think that's enough. Most people in our daily lives don't deal with statistics and the validity of statistics and the meaningfulness of those kinds of big numbers. So I think sometimes it's easy to put a doubt in people's mind as to, it seems a little bit like magic, right?
Because when you're testifying, you don't ever say this DNA is this person.
So
you would say it's
right,
likely this person.
Right. So we did not. The lab that I worked in each lab kind of had their procedure of how they handled that. We just reported straight out statistics. So we would say this is the profile had a match, and we wouldn't expect to see that match again, except if the population was this many billion people. So for a reasonable person, right, then you're like, okay, that was a match. Some labs would report what they called identity. So they would say, within a reasonable doubt, I can say that this person that is his or her profile. But no, we didn't. You're right.
So can DNA also get tricky when you're talking about brothers, nephews, cousins?
Yes, it does. So close relations are important in several things. So like I mentioned to you, if it's people who are living together or who have, then that DNA really doesn't mean that much if you find it on the carpet or, somewhere like that. But obviously, brothers and sisters still have individual DNA, right? So I have a brother, we would have different DNA profiles. We would have some similarities, right? And so the way DNA is done, there's about 13 different markers that are used. And so when you looked at mine and my brother's profile, we would probably have some similarities in some of those markers. But when you look at the totality of them, right, they're still going to be different because everybody's is unique, except for identical twins. they're going to have the same exact DNA profile. So you can't identify them, right, based on DNA. The other thing I wanted to mention, so I told you at the beginning that the type of DNA testing that I did at the crime lab was mitochondrial DNA analysis. So we're going to get into a little bit of biology here, but in every one of your cells, you have a nucleus. And when we talk about inheritance, that's what we're talking about. That's the DNA that makes your hair the color it is, your eyes the color they are, how tall you are, all the things, your enzymes that break down your food, all of that's coming from your nuclear DNA. And that's what we would use in all possibilities. That's the kind of DNA you would use in forensics because it's more distinguishable, right? Individual. Mitochondrial DNA comes from actually a different organelle in all of your cells. And that organelle is super important because that's what produces the energy that you need. So without mitochondria, your cells are going to die, so it's not good. But the key thing about mitochondria is my mitochondrial DNA is the same as my brother's, is the same as my mom, and is the same as my children. So sperm are one of the cells that actually has the most mitochondria, because if you think about it, they need a lot of energy. They have a long path to swim, right? But when they reach the egg does not let the mitochondrial DNA in from the sperm. It only lets the nuclear DNA in. So each new embryo only has mitochondrial DNA from the mom. Now, so you're thinking, why in the world would you mess with mitochondrial DNA? It doesn't seem very distinguishable, and you're right. But here's the reason we do. So if you were to pull a hair out of your head right now and it still had root tissue on the end of it, we could get a nuclear DNA profile from that, right? But you naturally will shed hair, right, that falls out. When that happens, there is no nuclear DNA to analyze because your hair isn't made of cells, right? But there is still mitochondrial DNA left there. So the only time you would do mitochondrial DNA is when there is not nuclear DNA to analyze, and you do it as a test of exclusion. So I'm never going to say, yep, there's a match, this person did it on mitochondrial DNA, but it's a way to try to exclude somebody. It's also a way to identify, so sometimes there are remains found, right? And they've been in conditions for a long time that have done away with any kind of soft tissue, and maybe there are no dental records to match for a missing person. So all that's left is, teeth and bones, and you may not be able to get nuclear DNA from that, but you can get mitochondrial DNA. So it's a way to be able to find, does this match a missing person? Or you may remember from the Lacey Peterson case, there was a hair that didn't have, so that I'm reaching way back many years ago, but there was a hair that didn't have nuclear DNA on her husband's boat that they used to do mitochondrial DNA analysis on. So anyway, the answer is yes. There can be, nuclear DNA can definitely distinguish against, siblings, but not mitochondrial DNA, but can't distinguish between twins. And like the newest really interesting thing, and I'm sure you've read about this, is using ancestry DNA, right, to be able to narrow down where this suspect, what kind of family relation this suspect might have based on all of this ancestry DNA.
So I think the science here is really cool, and I think it's very advanced, but it occurs to me that it is still people who are doing the science, and people are flawed. So
Yes.
does that ever impact what's happening here?
So yes. And so as you mentioned, everybody, right? I don't care how careful you are, every one of us is going to make mistakes. So there needs to be procedures and policies in place so that you have, ways to self-catch mistakes, and then you have someone that's coming back behind each person's work, right, to make sure you don't make mistakes. So some of you may have read in the last, I think, year, there was a medical examiner in Tarrant County, Dr. Mark Krause, and there was an autopsy that he had performed where he missed a bullet. So he didn't find a bullet in this autopsy. And The body was exhumed where they, found the bullet. Well, that sort of opened up questions. Okay, well, are there other things that he missed in other cases? So at that point, his boss, Dr. Perwani, who's been the medical examiner, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County for many, many years, I think 40, audited all of his cases and found some other areas that there were some things that were not thoroughly done, or there were some things that weren't addressed that should have been. Now, he did say that it didn't necessarily affect what was given as the cause of death, but, obviously that opens up questions about any convictions that were made, right? People that are serving time based on this medical examiner's work. There are other cases like that, right, where maybe a mistake was made, and so you have somebody come back and audit that, and then it obviously opens up, was a conviction, was it based on improper evidence or not? And that causes issues for lots of folks, especially those people who were convicted. But then you also have people who it's not a mistake, right? It's purposeful and intentional for many different reasons. One example of that is Joyce Gilchrist, who was a forensic chemist in Oklahoma City. And she was basically much overstating to a great degree, especially matches of hair and matches of fiber. So what I want to say about DNA is DNA, right? I mean, there's nothing subjective about it, right? If I run a DNA analysis, I'm not deciding whether the match is there or not. It's an exact science. But there are other sciences like blood spatter and trace analysis, so looking microscopically at hair under the microscope, at fibers under the microscope, that you are an expert at doing that, but it is still a more subjective science. So long story short, many defense attorneys were raising concerns about the testimony she was giving, that she was overstating, what was found. And ultimately, another forensic chemist was hired from another state to re-examine her evidence, and he wrote a letter saying there is no way that this testimony is accurate. Like, there's no way you could make this determination. That opened up an audit by the FBI, and many cases were found that the evidence did not match her testimony, or she was overstating things to get people convicted. And I want to say one thing there. So, for example, when I worked at the crime lab, if you found a sample, we could not consume that entire sample, right? We had to retain a piece of that sample so that the defense then could request that sample and have it tested by an outside lab. I think that's a very important thing that should happen. I think we also need to realize that depending on who the defendant is and how much money they have, that's a very expensive thing to do, right? To have that done. So they're paying for that out of pocket.
Is that one of the goals of the Innocence Project?
Yes.
Well, DNA retested.
So yes, the Innocence Project, and they may do more now, but they were working on people who were already convicted, right? So they were convicted maybe before DNA analysis was available. So at that time, maybe they were convicted simply on a blood typing. You know how there's people have type A blood, type B blood, type AB, type O. So many years ago, they would blood type the blood, right? And obviously we know many people have those types of blood walking around, but that was used as one way to say, well, it did match. He did have the same blood type. So, that kind of shows maybe he did it, or she. But yes, the Innocence Project, and while I was there, we had several cases that DNA testing was requested. There weren't very many cases that there was actual physical evidence to do that on. A lot of it was eyewitness testimony. We did have one case where there was hair evidence. Now, it wasn't enough hair, or there wasn't a root to do DNA testing. So it was going to be sent for mitochondrial DNA testing at that time. If you haven't seen the Netflix show How to Fix a Drug Scandal, it's actually very interesting. It follows two different forensic analysts, both I think were chemists, One of them, her job was actually to test drugs. So, I mean, you think about it, if someone is arrested with, this many, whatever, ounces or kilos or something of, quote, cocaine, somebody's got to verify that that is in fact cocaine, right? So there are drug chemists that do that, right? They test to make sure. Well, when you're doing that, you need a sample to compare that to. Remember, I mentioned to you that there's a process. You need quality control and you need positive and negative standards every test you do. So you need standards of those drugs. So pure of particular drugs to run through your, mass spectrometer or whatever you're using to analyze that. Well, this particular chemist, started out just really wanted to be able to take care of the caseload that was coming in. There was more cases coming in than she could do in the amount of time she was given. So she was trying to stay up longer and work longer. So she started actually taking methamphetamine that was there as a drug sample, got addicted to that, and eventually began, taking a little bit of drugs from the evidence that was submitted, and then was working on the job, high, and it was a really bad situation. Another one of the chemists. What's that?
I said spoiler alert.
Yeah. Sorry. But it's really interesting. But one of the other chemists, she was actually same thing. She wanted to be able to work the cases that came in and felt, like she needed to turn out reports quickly. And so she just quit testing them, like kind of looked at it and was like, yeah, that's cocaine, marked it, and moved on, and didn't actually test the drug. So neither of those is a good thing. And we certainly need procedures in place to make sure people are not doing that. That's not a mistake, right? That's just a really, really bad choice. And then you mentioned post-conviction testing. So ideally, we would like to not have people go to jail innocent, hopefully, right? And have to request post-conviction testing, because then we have an innocent person who's serving time. But at the same time, we have people who are serving time now, right, who didn't get DNA testing done. And so we need to offer them every opportunity to have that testing done so that they can be exonerated if they were in fact innocent.
All right, so if students have questions, you can.
I have so many questions.
Oh, sorry. Professor Davis Hanna has questions.
I don't know if you know this, Natalie, but I spend most of my life watching TV shows about solving murders.
Well, I knew that about you. So you probably got some really interesting things that I'm going to be like, I don't know.
So my first question is, I was called for jury duty once, and I'm sitting in downtown Fort Worth, and they make you fill out all these questionnaires to see if you're suitable for a jury. Usually those questions have to do with whether you have experience in your personal life with whatever is in the case, right? So if it's a drunk driving case, like, have you ever, do you have an alcohol problem? Things like that. But the questionnaire that I got was all about what TV shows I watch.
Really?
And yes. So it said, what TV shows do you watch? And then it gave me a box to write in answers. And then it specifically asked me if I watched certain shows.
Interesting.
And then I was like almost immediately disqualified from, not disqualified, but like I was immediately dismissed, right?
Yeah.
So does watching the shows, CSI, NCIS, all those shows, make me a bad candidate to be on a jury?
So two things, and it depends on who dismissed you, right? We don't know whether it was the prosecution or the defense.
That's true.
So, I'm not an attorney, so Kimberly can answer this, but my understanding from talking with attorneys is, it depends on the case. Sometimes they don't necessarily want someone coming in with any kind of information about, they want to be able to build that up for you, right? They want to give you the information. They don't want you thinking, why didn't they, show me blood spatter? Why didn't they talk about, I don't know, luminol testing? Does that make sense? They don't want you to come in with a lot of education or information about what's going on. The other thing is maybe they didn't want you to have preconceived ideas in a way that isn't reality. I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because I think if you watch those shows, then you expect every case to have DNA and every case to have fingerprints and every case to have ballistics, and they probably don't all have that.
That is exactly right. Yes, that is. I think you're probably right.
Okay. So I'm just going to keep answering those questions so then I can keep getting dismissed early from jury duty. Just kidding. Obviously I'm going to be honest. But my next question is, do you think, so touch DNA is way more advanced now. I mean, it's getting way more advanced, I think, all the time.
Yes.
I know that from documentaries, not from CSI, just so everyone. But isn't it going to get to a point where it's so good that it's no longer of any good value? Like, because you can tell, if a item is dropped at the scene of a crime, you can tell the past 5 people who touched it, but doesn't that not really tell you anything about the crime?
So that's a great question. I mean, it depends on what the item is, right? And how many people had access to it. So, I mean, just think about like a pin or something that's at a public place, or a door handle. Those things would there's no telling how many profiles you get on those. As a side note, this is really strange, but like I'm very, very careful about what I donate to places, because I always think if I wrote a crime novel, I would write it about like a coat that was donated to Goodwill and then somebody got it and used it in a murder, and then your profile's in there for wearing it. But anyway, that's just a side note. But so we had this one really interesting case, and I guess it really isn't that interesting. It's just that, thank goodness that criminals sometimes aren't that smart. But there was a case where I believe it was like just a burglary. I don't even remember the situation of the crime, but the person had broken in, right, and had done whatever they did, whatever crime, wearing latex gloves. No, it was an assault because there was blood on the gloves. So, or murder or something with blood. So they wore gloves, so that was smart, but they left them at the scene. So on one side of the gloves, we got the DNA profile from the person who was assaulted or killed, right, from their blood. On the other side, take the glove inside out, we got the wearer's profile. So in that case, that's very probative, right? But it depends on the situation. But wash your stuff before you donate it, so no one will commit a crime in it. With your DNA on it.
I think you should write crime novels, first of all.
Maybe you should help me. We'll co-write it, because I'm not a writer.
Okay, well, let's do it.
Okay.
I can do it. I read a lot of mystery novels. Okay. So I have another question, and you were talking about this at the very beginning. So you have field CSIs who go out to crime scenes and collect evidence, and they're experts really in collecting, finding, storing, transporting things. And then you have, I'm just going to call them lab experts who are doing the actual testing.
That is exactly right.
Are any of those forensic analysts, do any of them like stay with the case from start to finish?
No.
No,
the only person who's working a case really from start to finish is the detective that's assigned. So, I mean, in other words, they're responsible, right? Once the evidence is collected at the scene, or they may even be directing to make sure what evidence is collected, and they're following what's happening. They're making sense of all the reports that they're getting from the different analysts. That's really who's responsible for shepherding the case. Our job is, each analyst's job is really just take the evidence, figure out what, based on the scenario, what happened, what can you find on it that's meaningful, and then provide that information to the detective. That's pretty much, you have a job to do, and that's it.
All right. So my last question is, do you think that the rise, I mean, we've always had detective shows for like as long as we've had TV, but the number of shows about scientifically solving a crime has gone up, I think, in the last 20 years. Do you think that that's had a net positive or net negative effect on us? Like, is it better that we're interested in how crimes are solved, that we're interested in science, that we're interested in those things, or is it a negative because it's completely misleading?
Well, I think it's probably a mixed bag. I think it's great that, because I know I talk to people, students, just people in my everyday life, and I used to do that, and people would say, "What do you do?" And I would tell them. No one goes like, "Oh, that's boring." They're always like, "Oh." So I think it has potential to motivate people because I like STEM. I want to see more young people choose STEM fields. So anytime we can get people excited about looking through a microscope, I'm happy about that. And if they find out once they get in there, like, oh, it's not really, I don't get to wear like my high heels and my designer clothes, we'll work on that later. But I do think that, and the other thing is, I mean, sometimes, obviously, we're trying to get better and better and better in science always. So maybe those shows, we need to do a better job, I guess, in science of teaching what's real. And like webinars like these, we need to do a better job of, engaging our student and our public in media about what's real and what's not. And I think the documentaries, because there's a big rise in those are a huge help because that is reality, right? They're following the ins and outs of what's really going on. Did I skirt that question okay?
No, you did. Do you watch those?
I do watch those. I watch them some. It's just very strange. I used to love all of that stuff, and now I have to do it in small amounts.
Well, that's what we actually recommended in our last webinar, Natalie, is to
I watched it. The fact it was very good. Yeah.
Treat it like cake.
Yes. I'd rather have cake, but yes.
I don't know. That's all my question. I mean, I have obviously thousands more questions, but that's all the questions I'm going to ask you. We do have about 8 minutes left for students who want to chime in with their own questions. Just put them in the chat. And for those of you, do you have a next slide? Yes. So Professor Mertens just put in the chat the link to the survey form that will get your attendance recorded. Those get sent to your instructor and they apply your credit or extra credit, however is in their course policies. So make sure you fill out that form. If you're watching this as a recording in the next couple of days, then the form will be in the video description on YouTube. And again, while you're filling out that form and while we're wrapping up, if you have more questions for Professor Russell, let us know in the chat. And when you're filling out that form, do tell us your ideas for future webinar series. We're going to start planning the fall series soon. So let us know what you would like to have it on. And Professor Mertens, do you want to promote the Ukraine webinar?
Yes. So if you are at all interested, tomorrow we are going to do a question and answer session with two professors from UNT's International Conflict Studies Department, and they are going to answer TCC student questions about what is happening in Ukraine. I will get the link for that if you guys will give me 2 minutes, and I'll put it in our chat. Do you want to close this out?
Oh yeah, we've got 2 more webinars coming up in this series.
I want to hear about your webinars.
Okay. We have one on April 6th, and that's about political high crimes and political assassinations. So that'll be really interesting. I think that's our government professor doing that one. And then our May 4th is true crime sociology, and that is going to really answer our questions about why we're so fascinated with crime stories and with true crime, what it says about us, what kinds of stories we're interested in and why. Certain crimes are very notable and get lots of coverage and others don't. So all those kinds of questions about what it means what it means about us, what it says about our society. I can say words.
It's early.
That's going to be really interesting. So very different topics. We're going to cover it from all sides of the spectrum here. So Missy's putting in, or Professor Mertens is putting in the chat, the link to this survey to get credit, information about this, the webinar tomorrow to get information about the conflict in Ukraine, and our upcoming webinars are listed on the screen. I think that's it. Like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that like button. Just kidding, kind of.
We do have a YouTube channel if anybody would like to subscribe to us.
We do have that, but it's okay if you don't subscribe.
Thank you, Natalie. This was great.
Thank y'all. Hey, on the YouTube, so I just want to make sure so I can tell my students, is the YouTube channel on that form or on the flyer for them to watch after the fact?
The true crime flyer?
It is not, I don't believe, but I can give you the link. Is it?
Oh.
So if they want to watch this recording, I can just give them a link, right, to your YouTube channel. Okay, got it.
And I will get that to you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
Hey, it was fun. Y'all have a good day.
You too.
All right. Bye, Natalie.
Bye-bye.